Today we're going to talk about the aquatic ecosystems. And the first thing you need to know is that aquatic ecosystems are almost always limited by phosphorus, right? So nitrogen is important as well, but phosphorus is going to be the real key to having these aquatic ecosystems be limited and at equilibrium or not, okay? So we'll say that aquatic ecosystems are almost always limited by phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations. And as a result, we divide them up into two different groupings. We either call them eutrophic, which means there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, and therefore there's a lot of nutrients around to make a lot of food. Eutrophic environments. Trophic means food, right? U means true, so true. It's true that there's a high amount of food there, I guess, right? These are ecosystems that are nutrient rich. Okay, and support large amounts of life. Thank you. Okay, this is in contrast to what are called oligotrophic environments. And we've seen that prefix a few times this year. Oligo means short. Oopsies, I didn't mean to do that. Oligo means short, and so this one is short on resources, right? It has small amounts of resources, small amounts of food available. These are nutrient poor resources, or nutrient poor ecosystems, rather. And they generally have relatively small amounts of life, so they're at carrying capacity at very low numbers, right? And so sometimes what can happen in these oligotrophic environments is that they can sort of explode with life. You normally have this nutrient-poor ecosystem. You provide a little bit of nutrients to it, and that's going to raise the carrying capacities of everything very rapidly. Okay, this process is called eutrophication, which makes sense, right? Because if it's eutrophic, if eutrophic means nutrient rich, if you eutrophy something, that means adding nutrients to it. So this is the temporary addition of resources to an ecosystem. And normally, when we talk about eutrophication, we're talking about some sort of human interaction, okay? The most common type of eutrophication is runoff from a farm, right? So let's say a farmer goes and fertilizes his crops. He doesn't really calculate the exact amount of fertilizer that he needs. He just, puts on a bunch of it, right? Then he knows that he needs to water his plants, so he waters them a bunch, but he's not worried about oh, it had also rained in here, so the soil's already pretty saturated. So when he irrigates his crops, then a lot of that water was not able to then absorb into the soil, and so it runs off the top, and as it runs off the top, it's going to pick up all the fertilizer that he just put on. And where's it going to run into? Well, it's going to run into whatever the local body of water is, okay? So if the local body of water happens to be an oligotrophic system, in an oligotrophic environment, then all those nitrogen and phosphorus compounds that he had in his fertilizer will end up in the water, and that's going to massively increase the amount of producers in that water, which will then increase the amount of primary consumers, and yada, 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 and it drives all their carrying capacities up, which is fine, right? That's fine, except for the fact that he is not going to continue to provide fertilizer to that lake, right? He's not going to go over and dump fertilizer into the lake constantly, and so eventually that lake is going to, again, be devoid of nutrients, right? And then all the carrying capacities are going to go back down. And when the carrying capacities go back down, that's a nice way of saying everything that's between here and here dies, right? And so then you got a lot of stuff that's dying. And when a lot of stuff dies, that's going to lead to a bunch of decomposers being there. And when a bunch of decomposing things are there, that's going to reduce the amount of oxygen in the water, right? Reducing the amount of the oxygen in the water is going to cause more things to die, which is going to cause more decomposers, which is going to reduce the oxygen in the water further. You get where I'm going with this, right? So anytime that you ever go to a lake and there's a bunch of big dead fish that are washed up on the shore, right? We call it a fish kill. Fish kills are usually the result of eutrophication, right? You guys have probably seen eutrophication living in South Tampa here because the area out in the bay along Bayshore is a semi-oligotrophic environment. And one of the things that we see is in the summertime when everybody fertilizes their lawns trying to get their grass to grow and be all nice, and we get these giant rainstorms, right? All that fertilizer ends up in the bay along Bayshore, and you see massive blooms of algae, massive blooms of seaweed, and it smells disgusting over there. The reason why it smells disgusting is because it's become eutrophic, and it's got a massive boom then of producers, and eventually those producers will die, and they have to rot and decompose, and that's what smells terrible, right? Okay, so let's talk about the zones of aquatic ecosystems. So let's draw here. So we're gonna have something that looks like this, and maybe like this. Level off a little bit. Sure, something like that. Okay. So here's my aquatic ecosystem. Okay, I've got an area, the first area that we're going to look at. It's going to be this area that's really close to the shore. We'll say about right there. I guess it can go down a little further even. Okay, this area is called the littoral zone. And the littoral zone refers to, first of all, these are, let's put this up here. General zones. The first general zone is called the littoral zone, and this is going to be a zone that's near the shore, right? And it is also going to be very nutrient rich, and it's going to have sunlight, okay? So shallow, nutrient rich, area near the shore. Okay, then within the littoral zone, you got an area called the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone, maybe that's a little bit too much, but be like this area here. Okay, this is the area between high tide and low tide. And so organisms that are in between high and low tide, they have to be able to tolerate exposure to air because they're going to be exposed to air half the time, right? Roughly. Okay, another general zone is going to be this area right in here. This is called the benthic region. Okay, it's not really a zone because it's within zones, right? There's different benthic regions within each zone. And the benthic region just refers to stuff that is living on or in the sediment at the bottom. Organisms that live on or in the sediment at the bottom of a body of water. So again, in this case, it doesn't matter whether it is a ocean or a lake. Right? Both of them are going to have benthic zones, benthic regions. Okay? So, what else? How else do we define these? Well, if we have the sun, here's the sun. The sun penetrates down all the way through the littoral zone, and then eventually sort of trails out. Okay? Everything where the sun's rays reach, we call the euphotic zone. Everything where the sun's rays do not reach is called the aphotic zone. Euphotic zone. That's water that the sun's rays, or the sunlight, come on, can penetrate through. Okay, and I want to talk for a quick second about what affects the depth of the euphotic zone, right? So which types of things do you think affect the depth of the euphotic zone? How far down the sunlight can go?
And how to go, like how much salt's in there and if there's any
Yep.
besides salt.
So dissolved solutes. So salt doesn't affect it too much, but other dissolved solutes can definitely affect it. Specifically, tannins are really important. So tannins are these things that are contained, they're secondary compounds contained within leaves of trees. And so like it's the thing that makes iced tea colored, right? And it's also the thing that makes the Hillsborough River super, super dark brown, because as you think about all the leaves that fall off and wash into the Hillsborough River, all those leaves act like tea leaves, right? And they color the water brown, right? So dissolved solutes, tannins turn the water brown and reduce the photic zone, the euphotic zone. What else reduces the clarity of the water?
Plankton.
Yep, algae growth and plankton. So as the concentration of algae increases, clarity decreases. If you've ever seen a pool that's not cared for very well, the water's often cloudy, and the reason why the water becomes cloudy is from algae growth. What else reduces the clarity of the water? You guys ever been like walking along the beach and you're like, you know, walking in the water and you see a shell and you're like, oh, I want to go get that shell, and then you walk close to it and you kick up a bunch of sand and then you can't find the shell anymore because you kicked up all the sand around it? Yeah, so sediment that is in the water that's not settled is going to reduce the clarity, and so as the water is more turbulent, right, that's going to stir up more of the sediment, which is going to reduce the clarity of the water, and as the water's still, it's able to settle. Okay, so sediment that does not settle reduces clarity. These three things here affect a property of water that's called turbidity. Okay, the turbidity is basically the lack of clarity in water. So if water is very turbid, that means that it's not clear. You can't see through it, right? One other thing affects the depth of the photic zone. Intensity of sunlight, right? Where would you expect to find the most intense sun's rays? In the equator, right? So latitude. Or rather, the sun's intensity changes with latitude. And we talked about this already, right? When we talked about seasons and stuff, right? We showed that like this area here, the sun's rays were much more intense than this area because in this area they were much more spread out, right, than they were over here. Remember that? So we would expect that in this area, the photic zone would be deeper than in this area because this area, the sun's rays are not as intense. Okay? What else affects the intensity of the sun? Yeah.
Whether or not there's like tree cover.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So intensity of sunlight, intensity changes with latitude. We can also have shade from objects outside the water. What else? Also related to our drawing there. So this is not just latitude, but what else? Seasons. Right? So the photic zone varies by season as well. Let's talk about the aphotic zone. No sunlight penetrates. So if there's no sunlight penetrating, how is there anything living here? Is there anything living in the aphotic zone at all? Yes. So where does it live? How does it survive? Where all the nutrients come from? Okay, so we always go to hydrothermal vents. So we can talk about chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs can act as those producers. But the vast majority of life in the aphotic zone is not near hydrothermal vents.
Isn't it like dead? Like stuff falling down?
Yeah. Yes. So decomposers rely on dead organisms to sink to the bottom. Okay, and this is important because this means that the majority of stuff that's living in the deepest part of the ocean is not swimming, it's walking around, right? These are benthic organisms. Okay, there are these things that are called whale falls or whale islands, where the bottom of the ocean is pretty much barren. There's not a lot of life there, but when a whale falls down, a whale sinks to the bottom, right? It can create an ecosystem that can last like 50 to 100 years, just off of organisms that are feeding off of the dead whale, right? They eat the blubber and the tissue first, right? And then there are actually specialized organisms that come in and break down the bones, right? And the organisms that break down the bones create sulfur-containing compounds, which then allow for chemoautotrophs to move in, and then things eat the chemoautotrophic bacteria, and it's a whole ecosystem that's just based on these whales. And then afterwards, when the whale carcass is gone, they slowly die out. Their carrying capacity goes down little by little until that whale carcass is completely gone. Weird stuff. All right, let's talk about the zones, the specialized zones in lakes versus oceans. Let's talk about ocean zones first. So there's a zone called the pelagic zone that's open ocean. This is not near the shore. And we divide it up into three groups: the epipelagic, the mesopelagic, and the bathopelagic. Does that have a Y on it? I don't think so. Yeah, it does. Bathol. Whoa. What's happening here? Okay. And epi means surface. Surface open water. Mesopelagic, this is where the photic zone is going to transition into the aphotic zone. And then bathopelagic, this is the deepest parts of the ocean.
Like ocean trenches and whatnot.
Yep. So where are we going to see the least amount of organisms in the ocean? Which zone? Where specifically in the mesopelagic? The aphotic, yeah, so the lower parts of the mesopelagic zone, because we're aphotic, but we're not benthic at this time, and so there's not ground to support those organisms. There's not all kinds of sinking things. There's probably not hydrothermal vents, and so it's just this weird area where there's the area that's almost devoid of life once you first get to the area where there's no sunlight, but there's also no ocean floor, right? And then it picks back up once you get to the bathopelagic zone. And then we've got lake zones. So most of a lake is going to be the littoral zone, right? Because lakes are not as big, but you get some Great Lakes, right? There's a few Great Lakes in the United States. So we got some other different parts to that. There's a part called the limnetic zone. This is surface water that's not near the shore. And then underneath that, you've got an area that's called the profundal zone. This is deep water, not near the shore. So again, you've got, if we were going to draw these things up here, you'd have like epipelagic up here. And this would be for an ocean. But you could also have limnetic if it was a lake. And this area would be the mesopelagic in the ocean. And this is the bathopelagic in the ocean. And then this whole area here would be profundal. In a lake. Questions over any of those things? A short, like 3-minute video for you. Once my computer stops tripping out.